All right, my dudes, what's up? What's happening? We are at version 9 of this lecture. Uh, we're just going to keep going. We're going to keep trying to make it better. And, yeah, until it gets to a place where I feel like, okay, we're saying something now, we're moving. All right, my dudes, what time is it here? Give it a few more seconds, a few more minutes, but hope everyone has had a great week. And, yeah, we're going to do the best we can as always. Let me get this down a little bit here. Ah, there we go. Perfect. So now I can look at you a little bit easier. Look you in the eye. I can look you in the eye now. I can finally look you in the eye without having to go. It's been quite a journey, putting all this together and just working my ass off, I guess. Have I worked my ass off? I've worked hard on it. I'm trying to go at a good marathon pace. I'm not trying to sprint. I'm trying to have a good marathon pace. So earlier I hit my head right here. Yeah, this bump. I thought I smelled something weird, and so I was like looking over, like I was lying on my bed and smelled something weird, and so I leaned over, try to see if I could peer down the crack, and then like I hit my head, and then that hurt. So yeah, it is very weird talking to a camera in this way, but I'm beginning to visualize you guys more to see what you look like. I feel like I can, maybe because I finished a paper, but okay, so all right, welcome to the Heroes Lecture. And actually, you know what? Let me make sure of something real quick. Let me do this. Hold on, forget this. I want to do this real quick. Let me move this guy into here. So that'll go into there. Get rid of that. I think we can nuke a lot of these, right? I don't even think we need that. We definitely don't need this one. I don't think, right? Do I want to save? There's nothing really I wanted to save, I don't think. Actually, I don't know, though. How much memory do I have left? I have 12 gigs left. Man. Oh, I'm just very frustrated by... Damn. Well, this is just the nature of the beast, man, you know? $16 gigs. Well, how much are these? I just don't know what's taking up so much fucking room. I think I'll be fine. Let's just go. I think I'll be fine. Alright. Alright, guys. Welcome to the Heroes Lecture. And I'm just watching my memory here, but yes, we start at 4 minutes. Actually, no, we can do it like this. Alright, well anyways, welcome to the Heroes Lecture. Version 9. This is part 2, version 9. And we just continue to try to make this thing better. But in part 1, we talked about this phenomenon called the hero's story, the hero's journey, the hero's story. And this is this narrative structure that was defined by Joseph Campbell. And he popularized it. And basically, it was his work where he surveyed hundreds, maybe thousands of myths. Apparently, he loved reading myths from when he was a child. He was just obsessed, and he just devoured an unseen amount of literature and information, like if you look at his bibliography. But anyway, so he surveyed hundreds of myths, and he found consistent narrative patterns throughout a number of these myths. And he collected and organized, identified these consistent patterns and arranged them into a master pattern, into a master narrative structure. And he called this mankind's one great story, which is a grand narrative. And I thought about, what is a grand narrative? Why is it so important? I mean, we seem to think that there is one narrative for everyone. I mean, probably that's based on, well, it's probably instinctual, but it's also maybe just based on what we see, that there seems to be one reality. We all seem to live in the same world. If I jump off a cliff, I fall. If you jump off a cliff, you fall, right? The laws of physics, the reality seems to work in the same way for every person. So therefore, we would think, well, there's probably one reality for everyone. And I think in some sense, maybe we ran this experiment, right? It's always about it. There used to be local gods for different people, but they always wanted to figure out which one was the greatest god. And sorry, I'll be fading out every now and again. Sometimes I sneeze or whatever. So we seem to be in search of this narrative. Now, like, in a sense, we already have a number of narratives, and we tend to believe that narrative more or less is what applies to everyone. So even like an atheist has a grand narrative, or certainly has a narrative. I don't know if it's grand, but it's grand in the sense that it applies to everyone. But I think there's this deep need that we all admit to. Some of us validate it, some of us don't. Some of us think this is just wishful thinking, but we all seem to identify this need that we want to have some kind of narrative that ennobles us. A grand narrative. What does that mean? Grand meaning it's universal, but not just that. I mean, we already have grand narratives because we inherently believe that the reality that we perceive, that like our constructed reality, we inherently believe is essentially true for everyone. The degree, I mean, we may not be sure of that reality, I guess, but we tend to impose our reality on everyone. Like we all work within a grand narrative, but a true grand narrative, it's universal, but also is something great. And I think that something great is a connection to something transcendent. We have some kind of higher purpose. We may disagree on what transcendence means exactly, but I think essentially it means that we are connected somehow to something greater than ourselves, and that the purpose that we have is somehow supremely noble, that it's elevated, that it's exalted, it's morally good, that it's connected to something that's deeply admirable. So this is Joseph Campbell's take on a grand narrative. And his theory is interesting because I think it satisfies two requirements that we have about truth. I mean, we live in this postmodern world where we think everyone has their own truth and no one has a right to say someone's truth is better than others because that leads to, X, Y, Z. And it sort of leads to this despondency that how do I choose? How do I know which one is true? Well, maybe we just don't know, and it's best to just say we don't know. The interesting thing about Campbell's theory is that, so there's two criteria I think that we've all agreed upon that would be characteristic of a true grand narrative. The first one is that it should persist. Whatever is universally true should be something that has been there forever and that will last forever. Truth endures. I think we all kind of agree upon that. And that's why, we're here in America. When we go to Europe and we see these ancient castles, or we go to the museum and look at these ancient artifacts, there's a sense of awe that comes over us that this is from 5,000 years ago, or that it just kind of transports us. And things that last, instinctively they communicate something that maybe it contains within it something about our eternal story that if we were to connect to it, we would gain a sense of deep meaning and fulfillment. And so meaning is kind of this formula that is made up of persistence, something that lasts forever, or at least like thousands of years, right? So Joseph Campbell collected these narrative patterns from stories that were 5,000 years ago, 7,000 years ago, all throughout history, up until the recent day. Actually, we tell this hero's pattern. These narrative patterns persist unto today, so they cross history. So that kind of connotes some kind of deep truth. And then the other thing that really catches our attention about the Campbell theory is that these myths were not just a story of one person. This isn't just a Christian story, a Muslim story, a Jewish story. Because we're kind of skeptical of just one story where we now have to impose that story upon other people, or that this story only applies to a certain group of people. Only New Yorkers get to benefit from this grand narrative. Sorry, everyone else, you're kind of screwed just by, hey, the luck of fate. Sorry, you're out of luck. You weren't born in New York, right? Just kind of a silly example. But if the story only applies to one people group, then we're a little skeptical of that grand narrative. That's not so grand, is it? But these were mythologies collected around the world, cross-historical, cross-cultural. A story that's been repeated over and over and over again up into, again, this very day. That's what we talked about in the first lecture. That this master pattern, this collected narrative, I'm sorry, that this collected narrative is I hate bugs. Oh, hang on for a second. That this collected narrative has been told across all these different cultures. And so it makes you think twice. It's like, oh, the whole world has been telling this story for as long as we've been keeping record of mankind. And so that lends kind of a truth aspect to this narrative pattern. And so now what? We have this grand narrative. And what is the basic structure of this narrative? Well, it's departure, initiation, and return. So it's kind of this simple basic structure, and this is supposed to predict the arc of our lives. It's a grand narrative. This is the model through which we should view our lives. So it's interesting, and it's also grand in the sense that it predicts a noble purpose. I think the essence of a noble purpose is something that, right, connects us to something transcendent, greater than ourselves. Even like an atheist. I have several atheist friends, and they're very, very principled people. Very principled. And to me, that's kind of transcendent. They may not say the word transcendent, but it's transcendent in the sense that their dedication to a set of virtues or principles, it's like that's their connection to something eternal, right? Because these principles, it's like they endure. They've lasted through generation after generation, and the perception is that they will continue to last. Love, truth, kindness, courage, so integrity, all these things. So the Campbell narrative is really interesting for those reasons, right? It has persisted. It's shown persistence. It's shown universality, certainly across time, but also across cultures. And it's shown a noble aim, a purpose that is admirable. So this is the grand narrative that Joseph Campbell came up with. And, it's like, okay, right? Like, we have this narrative. It seems to make a lot of uh, a lot of claims about the human condition and what we are here to do. It seems to claim that there is a story, that there's a storyteller, there's a specific shape of reality, that if we coordinate ourselves with it, if we get in step with this pattern, that we will experience the deepest meaning, the deepest fulfillment of our lives. And those are big claims. And it's like, okay, well, how much faith can we put in this? I mean, certainly, okay, he has an interesting case, right? He surveyed all these different mythologies and such. I guess it's possible that we're all simultaneously wrong across, but it's like, do we see this anywhere else? And I think a great place to look, like to cross analyze it, right? To look at it in a different discipline, in a different way of analyzing, is through the lens that we see the world today, and that's science. That we inherently trust the precepts of science, the power of rationalism and empirical thought and rigorous observation and demonstration, right? Do we see this in the religion of today, right, which is science? And so if we can see this pattern emerge from multiple levels of analysis, then it kind of gives us more confidence that, okay, this could be something, right? This could be something. So that's generally how we move through the world, how we determine something is true, is we try to find multiple points of validation across different types of analysis. So, like, for example, you could, if you want to know if a restaurant is good, well, what do? You ask around, you take a look at the menu, you look at the reviews, maybe you look at photos of the restaurant. You're trying to verify, is this a good restaurant? And so, we do that for something that's small, for something as big as this that we may or may not dedicate our lives to. Hang on a second. Sorry about that. Can we see it in the language of today? So, can we see it in the language of science? And that's what this lecture is set out to do, is to say, take an exploration. And I take you through an exploration, I should say, on whether or not we see this pattern manifest itself through a different lens of observation, through a different kind of analysis. So let's take that journey. So when we're talking about a narrative, right? Stories or narratives are inherently motivational structures. Like, what is a story? A story is, this is me, this is the world, this is me in the world, right? You think about, what is a motivation then? A motivation is a character moving through the world for a specific purpose. So motivations imply an identity. They're connected. They're not exactly the same, but they're pretty connected. And identities tend to dictate motivations. They dictate a pattern of behavior. And then motivations also imply a setting. Even if you get a very general plot line, like, there was a man who was hungry who wanted food. Okay, that's a pretty basic story, but it implies something about the world, right? That the world is a place where you can get food, I would think. We don't know how difficult it is, or so obviously there's a lot to fill in with that story, but it's like, but yeah, a story is a motivation. The hero story is kind of like this narrative pattern. It's like a meta narrative where it sets up the base structure of the world. It sets up the character, and then how that character moves through the world. So if we're going to see if this narrative pattern exists in, let's say, the language of science, then what we're talking about is our purpose. Now, if we're talking about our purpose, then I think what we're really talking about is our ability to adapt. Purpose is a coordinating action. It's a coordinating principle. how you coordinate with the world is with purpose, with motivation, how you move through the world. And so then, if the hero's narrative is our purpose, then would we see that somewhere within us, within our physiology, right? Because if purpose is like our adaptation to the world, how we adapt to the world, how we coordinate ourselves with the world, then why don't we look at how we coordinate with the world? How do we move through the world? How do we coordinate ourselves? And then do we see the hero's narrative somehow manifest itself within that coordinating process? Okay, so let's take a look then at our physiology. How do we technically coordinate ourselves or adapt to the world? How do we survive, right? Okay, when you're talking about adaptation, when you're talking about coordination, you can really break down our physiology into two parts. And we essentially live in a duality that we're made up of basically two parts. We exist in a duality, and you might already know what that duality is. Like, what do you think that duality could be? Two parts. What are we made up of? If you were just to take the most top level view of who we are, how we actually map ourselves or coordinate ourselves to the world, what would these two parts be? Well, I mean, basically you could say it's head and heart. I mean, that's the most basic, or mind and body. And I should say that this duality it's well documented, and some people say that there's a duality within the universe. You could say like order and chaos. I would say that's been said. You could say masculine, feminine, heaven and earth. You could say yin and yang. Yang's kind of up here. So there's all this literature and study, and it's been written about and talked about. Movies have been made about it. We're all familiar with this duality. Okay, so mind and body, right? Now, when it comes to our physiology, again, purpose, from a physiological perspective, purpose is how we adapt to the world. It's a coordinating principle. You could say it's our connection to the world. We are driven by purpose, so we'll talk more about this. In terms of mind and body, technically, what are we saying? Physiologically speaking, what's mind and body? Well, certainly it's like, your brain, and then like the rest of you, but not all of your brain is necessarily the mind specifically. When we're talking about the mind in terms of that duality, we're talking about voluntary versus involuntary, right? The conscious awareness, what we consciously control, versus all the things that are operating beneath our awareness. You could say the things that just kind of arise, that happen to us, including the senses, how we interpret the world. So in terms of conscious awareness, technically speaking, we are talking about the prefrontal cortex, okay, and that's the frontal lobe of the brain. Hang on for a second. So we are talking about, oh, okay. So yeah, we're talking about the prefrontal cortex. Now, the prefrontal cortex is arranged like it's arranged in the very front, but it sits right on top of the premotor cortex, okay, which sits right in front of the motor cortex. So it's motor cortex, premotor cortex, prefrontal cortex. And so there's some idea that the prefrontal cortex maybe evolved out of this inherent motor cortex. Why is that important? There's a way in which you can view the brain in terms of that the brain is essentially premotor. That movement is the essential part of the brain. Now, if you were to map out what creates the most neural activity. If you were to say, okay, what types of things engage the brain the most? Because whatever activities involve the most of the brain is probably indicative of what the brain is for. And so you could say, okay, well, what is it for exactly? You know, what occupies or engages most of your brain? Is it thought, or is it action? Is it thinking, or is it moving? Like, there's a lot of different parts of the brain. What do you think it is? Well, I guess I kind of gave it away, but so when you're, let's say, writing a paper, okay, you're typing and you're trying to think and you're really trying to figure out like what to write, and then you scratch your head randomly while you go back to writing. The activity that engages your brain the most, the scratching your head, these little ancillary movements that don't really contribute to the conscious task at hand, that makes up a ton of neural activity. Movement engages the brain more than thinking, even random movements, let alone actual conscious movements. And so you could conceive of the entire brain as premotor. I mean, it's not totally far-fetched. And then I think in even stronger case is that the prefrontal cortex is best understood as essentially a motor, like a motor organ. That conscious awareness exists in order to get you to move. And that all of these, that the evolution, the dedication of resources, like you get the motor cortex, which is just instinctual movement, but then you have the premotor, and then you have prefrontal. Premotor and prefrontal means that these are areas of the brain that dedicate resources to determining which movement makes the most sense. And you think, well, why would it do that? Why is that so important? Well, movement is dangerous. Movement is risky. It's inherently costly, right? It burns resources, and it can lead to catastrophe. I mean, if you're trying to figure out where food is, and then you pick a direction and move towards the wrong place, then what happens? Not only have you spent resources, dedicated valuable resources to enacting that movement, but now you're even further away, probably. You're even further away from where the food is. Like if food is this way and you move that way, you've potentially deeply endangered your ability to survive. Movement is very costly and it's very risky. So in some sense, the brain conscious awareness, it exists like on a platform of movement. It orients itself to movement. Okay, so let's kind of think about it for a second. Now, when you come into the world, right? You come into the world, you're this helpless baby. Has anyone here ever tried to taken care of a baby? I have had the unfortunate experience of trying to care for a baby for about 10 minutes. And let me tell you something. It was awful. So I was, back in the day when I had a housemate, he had his niece, he was like babysitting his niece, who was like 1 or 2 years old. And we were just watching football or whatever, and she was playing on the carpet with her toys, and everything was great. And then he's like, hey, man, I have to go and take a phone call. Do you mind just watching her for a few minutes? And I was like, oh, yeah, no problem. And as soon as he left, there's a part of me that was like, holy shit, I have no idea. I hope nothing happens. I hope she just keeps playing with her toys. Lo and behold, a few minutes later, she starts crying, and then she's bawling. And I'm just like, I'm like this 22-year-old kid. And I was like, oh, what do I do? And I try to like pick her up, and I'm just like holding her, and she's just blasting away. Like, I can't, like, my ears are ringing, and she's crying. I'm starting to shake. And pretty soon my roommate comes back in. He's like, oh, he picks her up, and like this little rocker that they have, and he puts her in the rocker, like winds it up, and then she stops crying. And it's like, what happened there? I didn't know how to satisfy, like, how to calm her. I didn't know what she needed. I didn't know what to do. And basically that's what it's like when you come into the world. Now, she probably didn't know either. You come into the world with this inherited set of needs. And these needs announce themselves to you in sensations. They're nonverbal. They're basically unidentified. And you depend upon your parents to help you understand what these different sensations mean. Yeah, what these different sensations mean. So you have like desires, um, like they appear to you, they announce themselves to you in the form of pain. Essentially, desire is kind of like pain. And then your mom frantically or whatever, she maybe instinctively, she gives you a bottle of milk, she breastfeeds you, she rocks you to sleep, she hugs you, she gives you a toy, all of these different things to try to figure out, okay, what what do you need in this moment? And then when you have this need and you get the sensation that you wanted, the food, the drink, sorry about this. When you when these desires are fulfilled, what happens is your brain starts to build a map because you instinctively, like, you feel this pain and you instinctively want to be relieved of this pain. And then as your mom gives you different things from outside of yourself and you experience the relief, the the relief of this pain, the fulfillment of that desire, the pain turns into pleasure. It turns into a pleasant, peaceful sensation. Your brain is mapping that out. Your prefrontal cortex, all these systems are trying to triangulate on what satisfied those needs. And technically speaking, this happens in the prefrontal. A lot of it, there's different parts that coordinate to build out this map, but certainly one of them is this place called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the dorsal frontal cortex. Or I think they just say dorsal cortex. But anyways, and what this thing does is it's able to absorb all these different information centers in order to build out these complex sets of rules. It's a rule setting device. So you could think of it like a contextual, almost like a computer programmer that's building out this gaming world, for a player. It's able to take into account all these different factors and establish these different rules. So, okay. So basically, you're this child, right? You're understanding that the things that you need exist outside of you. And so what's happening is multiple things are happening at the same time. You're building this interpretive map of yourself, right? This map of desire within yourself where you say, okay, this sensation means I need water. This sensation means I need food. At the same time, you're building out the world where you're saying, oh, that's water, that's food. And your visual cortex is going into overdrive. The visual cortex is this amazing structure that's able to take your visual field and arrange it in such a way that you're able to identify the things that you need. It's driven by a motivation. Because the crazy thing is, like, if you take a person who was born blind, right, and they're an adult, and you heal them of their blindness so that they can now see, they still can't see. They cannot organize the world, or it's very difficult for them to organize the world into discernible visual objects. There's like multiple parts of your brain that are dedicated that are that are dedicated to the delineation and identification of objects. And the reason why you do that is so that you can fulfill those needs. Because when needs announce themselves to you, it's not like you don't understand what they are, it's just pain. And even now, like, as an adult, like, if I wake up in the morning, I have some weird ache somewhere, like in my head especially, I'm like, oh, God, God, it's probably a tumor, whatever. Like, you just think, shit, am I going to die? Like, what is this pain? I don't know what it is. And that's basically what it's like from the day you're born. You're filled with all these different, basically, pains, and you have no idea if they're going to kill you, if you don't know what it is, and so you're just crying all the time, trying to figure out how to identify these desires. So you're building out this map of desire, which is mapping on to the physical world, and you're learning how to see and understand space and objects. And also inherently with that, you're trying to build a map of movement, a map of action. You instinctively understand that you have a body, you're figuring that out, and that if you are able to coordinate your movements, you can then obtain the thing that you desire. I mean, certainly it's kind of simple when your mom hugs you, you arrange your body in a certain position to be hugged. When she kisses you, when she brings a bottle and she feeds you, you learn to see the bottle and you sort of learn to coordinate yourself such that you can, feed off the bottle. You know the game of airplane, right? And what's happening is I think the way we build up they're like sensory motor structures, like we build these encoded structures. The way we do that is through play, essentially. We perceive it as enjoyable, which makes sense because we need to do it. And so this airplane is fun because what's happening, we're learning to see and coordinate ourselves to this moving spoon of food, and then we hope that we kind of intercept it with our mouth, And it's kind of like catching a ball. Sensory motor controls, you're coordinating your senses to what's outside in the world. So you're building out all these structures. And so your understanding of movement is centered around desire. If you did not have a desire, you would not move. So, and in fact, the same system that moves you is the same system that regulates desire. That's how closely mapped movement and desire are. And of course, that's completely mapped to your perception of the world. So like all these things are happening at the same time. It's a multi-layered structure that it's like space-time. They all are just sort of the same side of this prism, this three-dimensional structure. It's like the map of the world, the map of yourself, essentially, which is a map of desire. But it's also what? It's a map of your physiology, the limitations and abilities of who you are. And then all of that is triangulated around a desire, right? Around a motivation. And so that's why they say conscious awareness is essentially a motor structure. Because movement is so, right? Again, it's so valuable. It's so important. How you move through the world, the efficiency of your movement, the expenditure of resources in an inherently limited world. You sort of understand that you're limited and that you have to have food and water regularly, oxygen, right? We need these things. And so it's like movement is our connection to the world. And movement is inherently driven by purpose. You're not going to expend resources without a need, without a purpose. And so we are oriented around movement, conscious awareness. From a pure physiological standpoint, conscious awareness is the dedication to the best movement. The most efficient, most effective, sequential, like action sequences, strings of movement commands. So we're built on this platform of movement, and so emotions essentially are built on movement, right? The way we tend to understand things in terms of movement, even if we're not physically moving. So like if we're trying to get a job, and we get a bunch of interviews, and then we have a great interview, and then we're hired. That whole time, we perceive it as forward movement because we're moving towards a goal. And we know from a child that we need to approach these goals in order to get the things that we need. So on a technical level, right, a lot of this happens in the orbital frontal cortex, which is a goal-setting device, and then in the dorsal cortex, which is a rule-setting device. And these are basically, there's all these devices that are a part of something called the action hierarchy, where, like, if you think about, going to work, for example, right? When you go to work, you get up in the morning and you engage in a number of activities that are part of the going to work action hierarchy. And so arranged in these concentric, basic concentric decisions, like a decision hierarchy. And even the decision to go to work is part of an action hierarchy, where instead of going to work, maybe you could just, be lazy and sleep in all day, or you could go sailing instead. And so you have to make these abstract decisions, and it's basically like getting your pants to getting dressed is actually part of a much larger action hierarchy, an action chain that starts with, I need to go to work because of XYZ. You have these nested motivations. And then the dorsal cortex is the device that helps define the different rules that have to do with going to work. It also defines the context of the situation. So the way in which your mind engages with your emotions, like so the way your mind engages with your emotions is that you basically want to have your thinking brain ahead of your emotions. Like, what's happening is that you're receiving all these different signals all the time. And it's your prefrontal cortex whose job it is to place all these in different frameworks. It's basically a giant rule-setting device in some sense, because your actions will be dependent upon your ability to identify and prioritize the different needs that you have, the different desires that you have, and your ability to break down the action sequences into steps, into sequential order, in order to accomplish overarching goals. And the dorsolateral is basically this device that's able to it's able to arrange your needs into a specific order. And so, for example, like, let's say you're walking down the street and what could it be? Like, you're walking down the street and then a car drives by and splashes you with water. Then you experience an immediate rage response, right? An aggressive rage response, and you might sort of fall apart in that moment, where you become dysregulated, and essentially you're simply acting out whatever senses are coming to you. But what hopefully happens is that eventually you start to apply different rule sets to help contextualize what just happened to you. And you can say, okay, like, oh my God, I'm wet. And it's not like you think you're going to die. You just are able to say, okay, this happened. And you start applying towards other sorts of rules where it's like, okay, I can just go home. I can change my clothes. I'm really annoyed. Maybe I can go get myself a hot cup of coffee. You engage all these different contexts to help you cope with that. And so the dorsal cortex is, and the prefrontal cortex as a whole, this conscious awareness, it's best if that is what is engaged first. Like, this is the device that you want to use that has evolved over time to help you contextualize and then define the correct action sequences that will allow you to be most adaptive to the world. The things that will allow you to move through the world in the most effective way. So let's say you don't engage your dorsolateral. You're going through a large crowd, someone bumps into you, and you simply engage your rage response, right? We're constantly being bombarded by sensations that don't really have any context with them. They just announce themselves to us as the most important thing, and that a person who is generally seen as someone not that resilient, not able to adapt, is someone who simply reacts to whatever sensation comes to them. You can think of like a 2-year-old. And so a 2-year-old does not have a very well-developed prefrontal cortex, and basically is just beholden to whatever sensation is that they're feeling. There's no centralizing framework. There's no overarching prioritizing context. They just simply have a sensation and then they act it out. So if you're going through a crowd, someone bumps into you and you get into a fight, well, you've just ignored a number of different contextual rules that are now going to get you into trouble. And that's going to be bad for your life. It's going to impair your ability to fulfill your goals. And so what happens is that the way the dorsolateral engages with the rest of your body, it has all these different switches. Like, first of all, it sits in a place where it's in front of like this dashboard. And the prefrontal cortex in general is, generally what they say is it's non-modular, which means that it's not like the visual cortex who's dedicated to just vision, or like your auditory or even like facial recognition. Like, there's a separate module in your brain that helps you recognize faces. It's kind of interesting. Read and interpret facial structures. That's sort of like a singular specialized function. But a lot of the areas within the prefrontal cortex are orchestrative, meaning that they are connected to multiple parts of the brain. And what they're supposed to do is take multiple streams of information and arrange them in such a way that you can advance your action hierarchy. That you can, what's the word? Sophisticate? That's not the word. That you can add complexity and sophistication to the rules that you apply towards your action hierarchy. I wonder what that word is. To sophisticate something, to add complexity to, I guess. Well, anyways, a lot of these structures are like the structures in the prefrontal are designed to help you fill out what kind of actions are appropriate and to help you decide which action sequences are the most adaptive to the world. So you kind of pre-arrange it in your head. You take in all the information, conscious awareness processes it, and then eventually you decide upon the right sequence of actions. And basically, when this happens, the dorsal cortex, so it takes time. The prefrontal is essentially a slow-moving organ. And so a good example of this is something called the Stroop task. Now, the Stroop task is this experiment where they had people sit down. And this is sort of a general summary, but they had people sit down and read off these flashcards. And on these flashcards were written different words. They were pretty simple, like, cat, dog, whatever. And people were reading off of it. And then sort of like halfway through, they were like, you know what? I don't want you to read the words. I want you to read the color that the words are written in instead. Because the words are all written in different colors. And so there's always a slowdown, right? Because they're reading the words, and now they have to read the colors. It sounds like cat, dog, and then they go, okay, purple, orange, yellow. There's a slowdown. And so what's happening is there's a pause. And basically this dorsal cortex, again, it's orchestrative, right? It's taking in all these different pieces of information, and it has a new rule now. It's a pretty simple rule change, but it's still like, what happens is your dorsal is arranging your entire physiology around these rules. And so it's arranging your physiology around these rules, and when you change the rule, you kind of have to reset, almost like switch to a different set of commands. So you could think of it this way. Like if I were to tell you, okay, I want you to get ready, you're about to run a 100-meter dash. You're about to sprint for 100 meters, okay? I want you to get ready, okay? So you get ready, and I go, just before the gun goes off, I go, actually, you know what? I'm sorry. I meant to say you're going to run a 5-mile race. Like, you can sort of feel that, and it's like, oh, shit. Like, it's almost like you have this motor command, this motor structure in place, which is kind of like a physiological structure in place for running fast versus running long. Or think of it like walking versus riding a bike. It's almost like this different persona that you have to switch to. And so when you're deciding which context, which physiological structure to embody, to inhabit, to like switch on, what's happening is that your dorsal cortex is sending signals, calming signals through your vagus nerve to the different centers of your body that it's connected to. It's your heart, your lungs, and your stomach. So it's calming your autonomic nervous system. And basically you kind of enter into this peaceful state. And so, like, usually it takes about, well, I don't know, it takes some time to engage your dorsal cortex so that you can select the right set of commands to move forward with. Sorry about this. So to engage the right set of commands to move forward with. And so, um, and so that's why, like, you know how meditators call it the gap. Like, that's why when you're confronted with a high stress situation, what you always want to do is try to pause. This is kind of like the physiological instantiation of patience. That's why patience is so important, because it takes time for you to kind of like overcome the sometimes very, very overwhelming signaling that's coming from your senses, where you're very stressed, you're very anxious or stressed, you're very scared, or you're very you enter into a state of rage. That it takes a little bit of time and practice to engage your dorsal cortex, which requires conscious effort, and eventually that cortex will start to send calming signals to your body as you start to explore different rule sets, different contextual rules. Should I punch this guy in the face? Or should I, maybe he didn't mean it that way. Maybe he's just having a bad day. Maybe that had nothing to do with me. Maybe I don't care what he says, right? You kind of have to remind yourself of these different rules sometimes, because you're constantly being bombarded by all this messaging. So you have this relationship between your mind and body, which is really important because, right, like if you just, like the body is this amazing signal creator, but it's not a great signal interpreter. Like it doesn't know, it's not able to coordinate itself very well with the world because it's just sensory. It's just sending you signals. And so it's the dorsal cortex job to arrange those signals into a coherent contextual framework with which you can now decide the best sequence of actions to enact in order to move you the most efficiently through the world, to get you closer towards your goals. One example of how the body interacts with rules is like they've done experiments where they're able to suppress different parts of your brain. They can actually, through I think electromagnets or something, they can suppress areas of the brain. And if they suppress your prefrontal cortex, but still have your motor cortex active, you can still perform complex motor functions. Like you don't need your prefrontal cortex to perform physically. And so if they like hand you a gun and they suppress your prefrontal cortex, what happens is your accuracy becomes insane. Like you just boom, target after target, you just nail everything. But what I can't tell you to do is I can't like apply some abstract rule like only hit the yellow targets, not the red targets. You're just going to blast every target. And so basically what that means is like your body, this reactive sensory organ, can perform complex tasks, but it's not very good at aligning those tasks with abstract rules, with goals, essentially. So it's like that's how these two pieces interact. One of them sort of like informs you what the world is, right? All your senses. It helps you build out the world. And you could think of that as rules in some sense. I mean, it's fairly complex, but you could sort of think of it as rules, where it's like if you're a computer programmer, you have to build out the world, and you have to code it in as rules, right? This is the color of the sky. This is the color of the water. Or this is how high you jump if you jump with this much force or whatever. These are all rules that you take into account that you learn from a child, right? Your visual field and your understanding of the world from a physics standpoint, for example, as well as the social context, the very complex layers of social rules that you have to understand. That we still get this wrong, right? Or we're like inappropriate. Sometimes I'm working at this restaurant, and sometimes sometimes people be like, "How are you?" and I'll say, "Thank you," or something like that, or "How are you?" I'll say, "You're welcome," and it's like because it's just like. I'm just kind of in automatic mode, and it's like the same gestures kind of look like other gestures, and I just execute a string command. Like you store motor movements, especially in your mouth. There's a special part of your brain that is in charge of like coordinating the muscles around your mouth, and you store things in codes, like in strings of commands, and you just kind of run the command and it just happens automatically. And it's probably an efficiency standpoint so that you don't have to think through each action. Um, when people ask me where the bathroom is, I go, it's all the way down the hall to the left. Like that pattern when I use my hand, I've done that so many times that I swear if I was like asleep and you asked me in my sleep where the bathroom was, I would just wake up and be like, oh, down the hall to the left. Like it's unconscious. It just happens. So anyways, like, so that's kind of this relationship between your dorsal cortex and then the rest of your body, that one of them is a supreme contextualizing device that's able to access and evaluate and then also construct complex strings of actions, motor commands that fulfill higher and higher sets of goals. And then you have this other structure, this involuntary structure, that's simply feeding you information. Sorry about that. That's simply feeding you tons of source data, sense data, that you then have to interpret into a structure. Hang on. All right, so right, we have these two structures, right? And basically, this is how we move through the world, that we are building out all of these different maps, and that we have to be aware of accessing our consciousness in order to like select and pick out the best rules, because basically our ability to survive is dependent upon, oh my god, that just scared the shit out of me. Woo! Sense data coming in, and then I saw the cat come out, and immediately my dorsal was like, okay, it's just a cat. It was just a cat. I thought like the ceiling was caving in for a second. It was just a cat coming out of the bed. Something must have fell down there. So I'm assessing that I'm safe. That was really interesting. So like, yeah, our ability to identify and prioritize. Yeah, it's our ability to identify and prioritize the most salient needs, and then to enact the correct action sequences, and then our ability to construct and identify the right action sequences in order to reach our goals in the most efficient way possible. So our ability to survive is dependent upon our ability to identify and prioritize our most salient needs, and then to generate the correct action sequences in order to accomplish them. The most efficient action sequence to, right, so it's like, and this is essentially what we do as a kid, and it's like we're constantly trying to figure out what this is. This is a dynamic process. We're constantly changing. The world is constantly changing. And so we're always building the map, checking the map, building the map, receiving incoming data, determining how accurate the map is. Do we need to make adjustments, right, to the map? It's this constant adjustment process, and it's like, but we don't really know. We still have needs that are unidentified, that we don't know exactly what will fulfill these different needs. And the higher up we go on this action hierarchy, right, this goal hierarchy, the harder it is to identify, because like lower needs are pretty easy. It's like, I'm thirsty, I'm gonna get some water. How do I get water? Well, I just walk up and, right, I have this this three-dimensional map of the world, and I understand how to coordinate my body such that you like that's pretty simple. But what about the need for meaning? It's like, how the hell do you get that? We don't know. It's really hard. Okay, so why don't we? Okay, so there we go. Wow, that was so. I'm kind of in the middle of constructing, like adding these new pieces to it, and so we'll see how it goes. But all right, guys, so that's version 9. I'm glad you were here, and yeah.